Very nice to be here, and exciting topic and speakers. So for you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Sonja Ayeb-Karlsson. I think the people who do know me, they probably know me from United Nations, the UNU, the United Nations University or University of Sussex. But this is also a good chance to say that I'll be transitioning to UCL and IRDR this year. So we will give the speakers of the panel about 10 minutes to introduce themselves and take their opinion or let us know why they think that we really need the IPCC, or if we don't need the IPCC at all. So I will start by handing over to Dr. Lisa Schipper, who is with University of Oxford. She's also an author of Chapter 18, Climate Resilient Development Pathways, on the latest assessment report working group 2.
Thank you, Sonja, and thank you, Ilan, for inviting me to this exciting event. As I'm coming first, I have the opportunity to give a little brief overview also of the IPCC, because for some of you, this might not be something that you're 100% familiar with. And since you found yourself in this webinar, you might think, well, I'd like to know actually what IPCC is before we get into critiquing it. So just a few slides on the process and what it entails. So if you ask my daughter, whose name is Celeste, what IPCC is, she will say it's important, positive, cool, Celeste, because that's IPCC. But actually, IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And obviously, her version of the title is because she wanted to take my attention away from all of the hours, days and nights I spent preparing at the end of February for our approval session for the Working Group 2 report. So the IPCC has a very clear mandate, and I'll get into soon who is actually kind of who the bosses. The idea is with IPCC is to assess on a comprehensive, objective, open and transparent basis the scientific, technical and socioeconomic information relevant to understanding the scientific basis of risk of human-induced climate change, its potential impacts and options for adaptation and mitigation. So it's really not a research endeavor at all. It is an assessment process. And critical to the IPCC, and this is taken from sort of the IPCC documentation, is that it is neutral with respect to policy, and therefore what we say is it's not policy prescriptive, it can be policy relevant. And so it has to somehow deal objectively with the scientific knowledge on climate change. I think we'll get back to that. But the IPCC didn't just sort of appear out of nowhere. It was actually quite a long process in the making. And it began when scientists came together in the late 70s to discuss the fact that actually there was something happening with the climate. And over the course of several years, there were multiple meetings. Eventually, something called the Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases was established with the World Meteorological Organization, the UN Environment Programme, and ICSA, which somebody else will have to tell exactly what the acronym is because I can't remember it right now. Scientific unions, International Council on Scientific Unions, I think might be what it is. More meetings were held, and then in 1988, governments decided that there needed to be an actual formal process, so that what was the AGGG turned into this formal Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. During this establishment, it was the World Meteorological Organization and UNEP that were the founders of the IPCC, and the IPCC Secretariat, the ones who publish the reports, the actual deal with the actual publication process, they still sit in the WMO. The interesting thing about IPCC, and Silke might get into this later, is that actually it is a scientific process that came up with a report, which the first report was published in 1990. And that led governments to decide that there needed to be a policy process because clearly the climate was changing. So in 1991, governments began a negotiation process. In 1992 at Rio, they signed this new climate change convention that then entered into force in 1994. So over the course of the last few years, you've seen how these assessment reports have fed into various specific policy developments in the UN Framework Convention space. Here, I just want to highlight that this arrow in the middle shows the quantity, well, it is supposed to represent the quantity of peer-reviewed literature over this period and how much we've actually, the explosion of climate change knowledge, which is of course a huge challenge for us now. The IPCC, because we're going to be talking about this, just to be clear, there are multiple different IPCCs, if you want. There is this Intergovernmental Panel that is the governments, then is each of these working groups, the physical science basis. That report for the sixth assessment report came in August last year. The working group 2 that Mark and I are in, impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. Working group 3, the mitigation of climate change, that just came in the beginning of April. There's also a task force on national greenhouse gas inventories. So it is sort of, it is a multiple bodies. And in this, there's of course also the authors, the contributing authors, the reviewers, and the governments. So there are many, many different actors involved. And the IPCC Secretariat is essentially the one that's tasked to make sure this whole process runs, to organize the meetings and the reports. So just to, so I also think it's important for you to know that in this, the kind of outputs that the IPCC has are these special reports that take about 2 years. Both Mark Pelling and I were involved in the special report on extreme events that came in 2012. Working group reports, these are the ones that have just come out. They take about 3 years and they come about every 6 or 7 years. But then we also have 2 kind of summary products that come out of each of these working group reports. The summary for policymakers, the SPM, and the technical summary, which is a bit of a longer summary, technical. So each working group also has that product. And those are the ones that get negotiated. Sorry, the summary for policymakers is the one that gets negotiated with governments during what was now, because it was virtual, a 2-week process that we've just been through. And I think we're still sleepless over it. And then there's going to be, at the end of this year, a synthesis report that brings together the 3 working group reports and the 3 special reports that have come out in this cycle. And here, if you don't know what they are, started with the 1.5 report that talked about kind of tried to understand this 1.5 limit, came in October 2018. The climate change and land report in 2019, and the ocean and cryosphere report that was also in 2019. And I guess I just want to emphasize this 1.5 report because it's quite different from the other reports, where actually here the government specifically requested in the Paris Agreement, they requested that the IPCC put together this 1.5 report, because the Paris Agreement talks about limiting global warming to 1.5, but actually it wasn't entirely clear what that meant, what the implications for that was. So there was a need to have a scientific process to kind of back that up. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but I want to just say that the IPCC process, I would say, despite potential flaws, which we may discuss today, it is a very robust process because there are multiple layers of peer review that goes through. We have peer review from experts in 3 cases in the chapter process. We have peer review from governments, and essentially anybody who's interested can sign up to be a peer reviewer. And all of these comments have to be responded to. As authors, we have to write our responses to all these comments to say how we've incorporated them. And these documents are also public. Good. So that was just my little bit of to give you a bit of an overview of the process. And then I want to just highlight 3 things that I think are important to think about and that have come up for me over and over again. I hope I'm not still showing my screen. Yeah, no, I'm not. So first I wanted to raise something. I mean, as I've said, the IPCC has been incredibly important in the sort of providing the scientific underlying knowledge for the policy process. And obviously, I'm really humbled to have had the chance to participate in 3 reports, but I wonder if it now hasn't already fulfilled its original purpose, because that was about understanding the climate system and whether and how it was changing, and these impacts and how the impacts that these changes were or could have on humans and natural systems were, and then how to identify policy solutions, which actually was part of the original brief. But in the 6th assessment cycle, we now have 4 out of 6 reports, and probably all of them, but really the last 3 working group reports and also the 1.5 report say very clearly that there is an extremely narrow window of opportunity to act. The 1.5 report said 2030 was a point where we really, if we have not acted by 2030, we're really going to face problems. The Working Group 2 report is very clear that this window of opportunity is within the next decade. So that makes me wonder, what does this actually suggest for the 7th assessment cycle, which many people are already talking about, the next assessment cycle? Because by the time that report is done, we're basically facing this kind of the closure of this window of opportunity. So I think this raises lots of questions, but one of the things I think is, how would the IPCC adapt to absorb the reality of the messages in its very own reports? And then another question related to that is, who's actually going to take responsibility to make adjustments? And this is really, I think, the biggest problem, because there are many governments who are part of it, the Intergovernmental Panel, who don't necessarily want the IPCC to have a very effective voice. Second point that I want to raise is the fact that I think related to this is also kind of the role that we play as scientists. I didn't mention we're unpaid. This is not something that you get any funding for. You get, as a coordinating lead author, you get a little bit of money to support, well, depends where you come from. In the case of the UK government, actually provides a little stipend that can be used to pay for a chapter scientist to support you throughout the work, but there's no salary involved there. And so it is really up to kind of the individuals to be committed to take on this extra work. And in late 2021, so last year, Bruce Glavovich and colleagues wrote a viewpoint on the tragedy of climate science. And this lamented the lack of action on climate and suggested that climate scientists need to strike and stop their research. And this created an uproar. And I have to admit, it was a little bit unexpected, because the viewpoint was in the journal that I co-edit, Climate and Development, and so I was not expecting this sort of uproar. But it was intending to, but it got more attention than we expected, I think. There is really a need to rethink this science for policy process. And I think that's partly why it stirred so much, sort of, people felt threatened by it, but also this notion that we have to kind of stop doing what we're doing. Because what is actually I mean, the IPCC was created before a policy process was in place, but obviously it's inherently linked to the UN Framework Convention. So does this mean that policy will always follow science? And I think, yeah, not really. And I think Silke is going to get onto this more, but it emphasizes this relationship that is quite fraught, and certainly makes us ask questions about sort of, what does it mean to listen to the science, and what science is that? And then finally, I think for me, I mean, there are a lot of other issues, but I just want to raise a third one, which I think is, who's supposed to be acting on the science? To me, the big elephant in the room of IPCC reports is that because of the inability to be policy prescriptive, we aren't able to talk very well about the responsibility. And that means that the science is kind of left on the table, like, this is what we know. But obviously, we also know that there are certain actors who have a bigger share, kind of who've contributed more to the problem, who have a bigger responsibility to act, and actually, whose actions are causing additional problems. So I think this lack of ability to point fingers like that is, and which incidentally is part of sort of, it's in the science. It's not that it's sort of, the authors will come and be kind of activists and start pointing fingers at countries they don't like or actors they don't like, but it's actually part of the research as well. It's just that science that we assess, we have to sort of, we're not able to really get into that part of it. So I think I'm just going to leave it there, because I could go on for hours about these kinds of issues.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Actually, your third point is on my intervention list for the debate later on, or the discussion. So I'll raise that later on. But for now, I'll move on to our second speaker, who is Professor Mark Pelling. Mark is based at King's College London, and he is in the most recent Working Group 2 report, like Lisa already clarified, and author of Chapter 6, Cities, Settlement and Key Infrastructure. So over to you, Mark.
Thanks very much, and thanks to UKAGR as well for providing this forum to ask a question which isn't often asked. And I'm going to offer just a very personal view. So Lisa's very effectively outlined some of the sort of broader questions, context, structure for the IPCC. And this is a a deeper dive, if you like, into some of my experiences as an author, as again Lisa said, from the SREX report, so the Special Report on Extreme Events and Adaptation to Climate Change in 2012, through the AR5 cycle, and then into the AR6 and beyond. And I'll maybe frame the IPCC in a slightly different way, in as much as I'll talk to it through three particular discussion points, both as an object which is centered upon the writing of the IPCC report, but also as a space that exists outside of that. So the IPCC, I think, exists in the science community, science funders that are anticipating what might be needed in a future round of the IPCC, positioning themselves, if you like, to have voice, so the IPCC can be felt there, but also in the response to the IPCC. So one already sees now, in response to the 6th assessment report, conversations amongst funders or in research groups in responding to funding opportunities that are drawing, of course, from the IPCC, as though it is the most authoritative voice on the cutting edge of science. And for sure it is in some respects, but it's perhaps less contested than it might be. So for me, the IPCC, the weight of it, even in the science community, so not thinking about policy relationships, exists in that much broader space. So perhaps another kind of introductory comment, again, building on Lisa's really helpful overview, just a couple of things to bear in mind about the process. So first, as Lisa said, we are being asked to produce material which is policy neutral, but policy relevant. So you try doing that. It has to be current, it has to be actionable, but not using words like need or must or should. So that straight away you can see there's a sort of intellectual dance, drawing on the literature, not presenting work as though it's in some way finalizing, but yet needing to assert the importance of certain positions that come from the literature. Which takes me to the second point in terms of the broad context. In order to get to those positions, one would hope that that requires a process of science consensus building. Again, not yet thinking about the co-production with government, just within the writing environment. And indeed, that does happen. And in my experience, that's what we spend an awful lot of time doing, working with different personalities across different power hierarchies to try to enable spaces of consensus building from different science positions. But again, as Lisa said, in presenting the IPCC as a collection of different places, the working group 1, 2, and 3, within our working group 2, and I'm sure it's the same for others, each chapter is a world unto itself. So our chapter 6 on cities, settlements, and key infrastructure had 3 coordinating lead authors, and we have the responsibility for drawing together the chapter, which had 8 lead authors and something like 20 contributing authors. And as well as just bringing together the narrative, of course, we have an unwritten responsibility, which is to create a safe space, a conducive space, an open space for consensus. But that might not be the same in other chapters. And indeed, I've certainly experienced colleagues from chapters across that arc of reports that I mentioned, where the chapters have imploded, where people have walked out and left, purely, I think, because of the sort of personal politics and lack of attention to the need for creating space for genuine consensus. So I've spoken a lot, even on that kind of introductory point, but to me, it's one of the biggest pressures of work. And given everyone's positionality, and particularly, I guess, as a sort of privileged white male academic, there are all sorts of responsibilities that one perhaps finds difficult. One has one's positionality, yet you have to put yourself in the position of others. Then bring in the literature, so the voices of the academy, of our colleagues, and it's our job to be a conduit for the best in that literature. But of course, the literature is written in very many different ways. One of the things we tried to do in the cities chapter was to bring together an assessment of 21 different generic types of adaptation in cities and on infrastructure, and measure them against 17 components of what's called climate resilient development. Again, Lisa's been very involved with that. I'm sure many of you have, bringing together adaptation, mitigation, sustainable development. Now, the literature on some bits of adaptation, grey physical infrastructure, for example, tends to be quite neutral, critical, technical, fine. Social policy literature, coming from a more social science tradition, tends to be really, really critical. So even where you are quite aware from your own work that a bit of adaptation perhaps reaches into the space of enabling social transformation or ecological security, the literature will tend to critique and draw out a negative view. And our job is to report the literature. So again, just to flag that one of the biggest challenges, we've got the consensus building, the policy neutrality, and then it's placing oneself next to, within the literature, being mindful that one is also an actor in producing that literature. So not wanting to promote one's own literature or one's own viewpoint, but then that is one's expertise. So that's the difficulty, and there's a lot of expert judgment, and we are selected as authors because of, I guess, our breadth of knowledge, which implies we have some capacity for standing back and placing expert judgment. So those were just my introductory comments to try to give you a sense of the, it's really a challenging process. That's outside of just the difficulty of the technical task. Now, the three things I wanted to just offer to you, I won't, I think, come to a judgment on whether the IPCC is something to support strongly or not in going forward, but I want to think a little bit about the legacy of the IPCC, what it's enabled and maybe accelerated across that broader space that I mentioned in the introduction, what the institution of the IPCC has made more difficult or contributes to that's perhaps a little bit problematic in the way that science unfolds, and maybe a final reflection on the process itself. So what do I feel the IPCC has enabled or accelerated? Certainly community interaction and the building of community. SREX has been reported. So that was the first time, despite lots of noises off, it was the first time that the disaster risk reduction, risk management, humanitarian community had come into a joint project at scale with the climate change adaptation and the climate science communities. And for me, this is the highlight of any of the IPCC. Hugely stimulating, really rewarding, fantastic people that you could work with, and really changing, I think, the narrative within the IPCC. So it was in this special report that the narrative of risk became really an organizing principle for climate change, how climate change is felt and responded to. It also introduced the notion of transformation, that adaptation to climate change is not simply a technical response to climate stimuli or hazards, but is actually an area of public policy, so needs to be held up against all of those guidelines and criteria for effective public policy, including questions of social justice. So some really important ways in which the climate narrative has been shifted because of bringing those communities together. And you see these relationships unfolding in all sorts of places. So that is something that, maybe couldn't have been done at such scale, in such depth, really writing together, sharing ideas, melding ideas without the IPCC. It also offers a place for scrutiny of ideas, and transformation that I've already mentioned, I think, is an example of one of those. So transformation came up in SREX, and then in AR5, its meaning was completely changed. So actually there were 4 meanings given to transformation, transformative adaptation in AR5, at least 4 that I found, there may be more. So the meaning of transformation was, yes, that it's a place for social justice, or that it is describing what happens when you bring mitigation and adaptation ambitions together. That it is that sort of adaptation that happens once the limits of contemporary adaptation capacity or adaptive capacity are met. And finally, that it's just big stuff with large footprints. So that was the context of AR5. In AR6, transformation has honed down into its original meaning. So you can see an arc there where an important idea has really been tested against a specific community. I'll jump now to the second of these sets of ideas, maybe what the IPCC has made more difficult. So one of these is path dependency in thinking. The very structure of the IPCC working group 1, 2, 3 suggests a linearity, suggests that climate science is the starting point, adaptation is the intermediary, mitigation is what we do with what's left over. Of course, that's nonsense. Even within working group 2, the title of our working group is Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability, which again suggests we are impacted, there is adaptation, and vulnerability is the residual. Whereas many would argue the vulnerability is the precursor for what determines impacts and a close association with a capacity to adapt. In AR6, there was a real effort to bring vulnerability right to the fore, and a particular figure that was brought forward into the SPM that was taken out by government. I'm sure we can discuss that later if we want to. So there's a groundswell of interest to do that. Picking up on a second point on what the IPCC finds difficult, again, one of the points Lisa made about who's the audience for acting. For many of us, especially working in cities, it's the non-state actor that's really who we want to talk to, the urban, the municipal, the community. But these are not the target audience for the IPCC. Finally, then, the last point I'll make in terms of process is the IPCC can only, I suppose, reflect science in terms of inclusion. So it is still biased, although I guess marginally, but it is still biased against women and against Global South authorship. If you have a look, and just throw a couple of facts and then I'll finish, on the Working Group 2 their website, there were 270 authors in the report from 67 countries, broad, I guess, 57% from developed countries, 43 from developing, 59% men, 41% women. So take those figures as you will. Certainly layer on top of that embedded hierarchies across gender, discipline, geography that will intervene between what we see in those statistics and actually the social production of knowledge in the IPCC. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. I really like this point you made in terms of, whose voice is really, the representation of the IPCC. And you mentioned that, I think you said male and, what's the other thing? Male and white. I would add something, and it's not a personal attack, but I would also add old and English speaking, like you said in the end. So I suppose that is something to think about, that if it's really, with the narrative around climate change, if those are the voices and that's the research and knowledge that we really want to see in the IPCC, that would be interesting to pick up later on in the debate. I'll move on to our next speaker, who is Professor Silke Beck from Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research. Most welcome.
Okay, thank you for the invitation, and I want to share my slide with you. Let's. Okay, so in order to avoid misunderstandings, I don't want to challenge the IPCC and its achievements, but in my talk, because I anticipated that Lisa and Mark will make a lot of very rich thoughts about the IPCC. So I don't want to take a look back, but to invite you to take a look forward, where we stand now and how future challenges could look like, and whether or not the IPCC could serve the function or be the forum in order to address these challenges. Let me shortly introduce into my own position. So I started with my PhD in 1994 on the IPCC, and this was a time where nobody knew what the IPCC is and how it works and what it's standing for. So I was feeling like a pioneer. I never directly contributed to the IPCC, but now I'm contributing to IPBES, that's the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and I'm lead author for the assessment of transformative change. And this is the topic I want to talk in this short note. Let me start with gaps. So one could describe the situation, mind the gaps. So we have the emission gap, we have the ambition gap, that our policy achievements may not reach the policy targets or the emission targets. And we have the gap between science and policy making. And we have all this gap, even if we have had excellent international science, we have an excellent assessment body producing authoritative knowledge. I'm able to speak with one voice, and we often talk about international or diplomatic breakthroughs in policy making. At the same time, we can ask the question, why do we have the gaps? Why is the knowledge that we have not really resonating with people or politicians' demands? And so the question is, how can we address this gap and move beyond these gaps and look ahead? And we can say that after AR5 or at least AR6, the IPCC is moving into a new phase. And this phase could also be seen as a constitutional moment to rethink what the IPCC is standing for, what is its task, what is its function, and what is its policy relevance. So already with the Paris Agreement, we are turning from historical trajectories to future pathways. And as mentioned by Lisa and Mark, we are turning from risk assessment, attributing causes and detecting impacts to anticipating solutions and pathways how to achieve the temperature targets. So the question is, what role can social scientists, but also humanities play in this new setting, but also how can the IPCC or expertise respond to these novel challenges and changing context in a responsible and responsive way? This also leads to a new question and the imperative to maybe reframe the research agenda. So one of the question guiding could be that even if we have a lot of money and even this scientific knowledge about IPCC and its consequences is mounting, why are substantial segments of developed national publics still not persuaded of a need for urgent action? And why face the shared knowledge base provided by the IPCC resistance and controversies in some countries while securing public compliance, cooperation, and active support in other countries? And what is it about the production of knowledge as conventionally understood that inhibits justice? And I feel this question has been taken up by Lisa and Mark in different ways. So what inhibits justice in producing knowledge about climate change, and how could knowledge making be made more coherent and compatible with society's demands for just policies? So one of my answers is that one of the problems that inhibits justice, but also more effective science policy interaction, it's the belief in the linear model. Hans von Storch at some point told me, Silke, if there is a natural scientist, you will have the linear model. So what is the linear model? It's the expectation then that more and better science will trigger politically actions, and that experts are acting as a global referee or neutral arbiter in the planetary playing field. And it's also the idea that science determines policy making. As a journalist has observed, aside, once we agree that what science says, policy will automatically follow. And the role of social science in this setting is to translate hard scientific knowledge into the one and only silver bullet solution. And this linearity can also be found when it comes to the pathways or the future that's projected by the IPCC. The IPCC, based on integrated assessment models, tends to project the future as linear and directed. And it's based, or the models are based on techno-optimistic optimization-based assumption of economic growth with carbon price as the main driver. And in this way, the IPCC reproduces but also stabilizes the dominant paradigm of progress, piecemeal politics, and a narrow techno-economic rationality. So at the end of the day, we also have this kind of tunnel vision. So the horizon of possible action is narrowed down to technically feasible pathways. And these assumptions are guiding policy decisions, but they are also legitimating policy choices in the present. And these techno solutions for climate change, such as negative emissions, carbon dioxide removal, and so on, they are often presented as necessary and enable to achieve the Paris Agreement. And this presents a sense of ongoing crisis, process that combines all of us into a catastrophic future that requires immediate and radical decision. And as we as STS scholars always complain, this mode of anticipating climate futures also contributes to preempt political consideration of alternative futures. So I'm asking whether it's in time to rethink or to also look beyond these one-dimensional and linear framings of climate solutions, and to move beyond the reliance on technology-based mitigation pathways, where we treat symptoms of climate change, such as sinks, rather than addressing underlying causes, or this typical end of pipe solution, and where we tend to stabilize rather than challenge path dependency, point made by Mark, and where we stabilized lock-ins, such as, and that's reinforcing entrenched power structures and lifestyles. And this uncritical adoption and naturalization of techno-based pathways also contributes to sidetrack questions of distributive impact: who wins, who loses, who speaks for the most vulnerable and marginalized groups. And it also contributes to sideline the added urgency and possibility of radical system change. So, but I will move on. So I would like to invite you to the thought experiment. Imagine climate change from a bottom-up perspective, and discover the more societal and political parts of climate change risk in terms of who wins, who loses, but also narratives and local knowledge needs. And as mentioned by Sonja and Mark, and it's also very important to raise questions of agency and voice. As we have seen, the IPCC is consisting of wide young or old men from developed countries. And the question still remains, or it's one of the main challenges the IPCC is dealing since its beginning, how to include experts from developing countries. And it's not simply bringing experts to the table, but it's also how to give them a voice in these science and model-based assessments, where you need a lot of capacity in terms of modeling skills, scenario building, and so on, and to equally participate in this discourse. So I personally think the future challenges are to think about how to engage with tools for imagining alternative futures, and opening up the IPCC to bring in alternative futures, for instance, scenarios with degrowth, pathways and so on, but also how to design or anticipate climate futures in a more pluralistic and democratic way, and in this way also rethink how we can enable debates about ownership of transformation in a more democratic way, and also bringing in people to deal with the problem in order to enable transformative change. Thank you very much. So up to, yeah.
Thank you so much, Silke. So we will open up to the whole panel, and there's been some great questions made already, and I think there's some answers as well to some of those questions. So thank you for that. I saw that the first question was a quite general one that doesn't have any answer. It's from Kara Tuninger. What would you recommend instead of the IPCC report? So why don't we start with that?
Go on, Lisa.
Oh, sorry. I'm wondering if it was just because I did mention, you know, how is the IPCC still fit for purpose in the sense, or is it kind of expiring? I think the idea isn't really that we don't need to continue to have science and these sort of assessments, because they do an amazing, I mean, it's exhausting and it's almost impossible given the quantity of publications that are out there. But but they do a very extensive job of really synthesizing and bringing together the knowledge to see, well, what do we understand, what do we not really understand. But I think what we need probably now, because we understand that there's a problem and we have a huge list of things that work and that we need to address, right? So I think the real issue is maybe should we think of these as much shorter reports. So I'm not suggesting that IPCC needs to disappear. I think there is a role for it. It's just maybe rethinking the reports, because I mean, I don't want to sound like, you know, there are many fabulous researchers around the world, but I mean, Mark and I have been really occupied in this for the last 3 years, and it has taken a huge amount of our time. And for instance, my contract is expiring at Oxford because I haven't had time to find research funding because I've been so engaged with IPCC process. So I think, you know, it's just, it is actually a huge burden on the authors, but also if you think about that generally, like across the community, what burden this is, what could we have done instead with all of that time?
Yeah, that's true. I guess the bigger fear is if you were to get rid of the IPCC and there was a vacuum, that might let a lot of people off the hook who at least have some sort of scrutiny from science, even if that's limited. Science, especially if you want to call it elite science of the type that the IPCC fosters, and that, you know, is an area to challenge. Those people often sit quite close to the policymakers that we want to hold to account. So maybe there's a kind of, you know, social process and value that's important. The way the IPCC seems to be heading though is to kind of get bigger. Perhaps I'm completely wrong, but you know, it's about producing secondary reports with more detailed technical work that's more easily digestible, as Lisa says, smaller focused work, but that means multiple. And goodness knows how, you know, one's life could easily be, if that's the model, IPCC, unpaid for, I mean, not even time allocated in an academic post. But if one looked at that positively, I guess it's that one could think of journals like Climate and Development and others producing a kind of world kind of, you know, a sisterhood or a brotherhood of academic engagement, where the IPCC, particularly if it's broken down, is a part of it, but we have kind of continuing conversations and extensions and rebuttals, and that to me is super rich. So I hope we're heading in that sort of direction. Thanks.
You want to comment, Silke, or should I move on?
I can only support this. So I can also encourage to think more how the IPCC can work together with existing whatever assessments at the national or regional level, with other platforms such as IPBES, who's also which is also working on transformative change, that we can think of a more nested structure between the IPCC and other knowledge producing institutions and exchange knowledges. And when it comes to adaptation or transformative change, you don't need only the global level, but there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of things ongoing on national and regional levels.
Mm. There was a question made in regards to how IPCC is collaborating and connecting with other climate change institutes and ongoing things. So I'd like to take that question, but also link it to the UNFCCC COP, because I also hear a lot of people saying, you know, oh my gosh, COP27, have we been doing this for 27 years? And what's happening, or what has changed since we started that? Is your feeling that the IPCC is another version of COP, or that they're two things on the same coin? And maybe how does it link to one another? Do you feel like the IPCC is very aligned with what's going on with the UNFCCC and the COPs?
I'm surprised how separated they are. So, and again, I might just a very narrow personal view, but I don't see any direct lines of engagement between IPCC and COP. Perhaps at the level of the co-chairs that exist, or individuals that overlap in their own career paths, but there's no, you know, direct engagement, and often the chronology of the IPCC, you know, doesn't allow that, or if it does, it's serendipitous, I think. Obviously, this time around, COVID completely threw the agenda up into the air, so it meant we weren't able to inform, I think, the COP process as much as we would have liked to.
I think it's important to underscore the different purposes also. I mean, again, one is the science. It's supposed to be, according to the IPCC description, neutral. Of course, I think we all know that there is no such thing as neutral apolitical science, but that the policy process is there to kind of operationalize the science, if you want, right? So whether it does that or not is obviously a political issue, and I think that's one of the challenges, is that a lot of the topics are sensitive. I mean, one example might be the fact that in the summary for policymakers of Working Group 2, throughout we have the phrase losses and damages rather than loss and damage, which is the phrase used in the UN Framework Convention, and it's a very contested concept. And part of the reason why it's losses and damages in the SPM report is because it's supposed to distinguish between the political process and the scientific process. But of course, in reality, we know that actually what it does is that it impedes the conversation. And so even though there's sort of an attempt to make this distinction, we always know that behind there is the political process.
Should I move on, or would you like to comment, Silke?
Yeah, it's always said what I wanted to say, but I would add something that when it comes to science policy interaction, it's not simply direct interaction, but it's also a very important a symbolic function that the IPCC fulfills, and the IPCC often provides scientific evidence that the policy targets are feasible, and this message is very important to encourage negotiations. And I would invite you, imagine if the IPCC would say that the 1.5 target is not feasible anymore. This would be a very toxic political message, and I guess it may have unintended consequences, and the whole CCC system will collapse, or it will be disencouraged in a very dramatic way.
There are several questions. I'll try to cover more than one to make sure that everyone gets a voice, but there are questions related to how the IPCC views the social justice movements and grassroots organizations and the youth movements. But then there are also comments about whether or not and if the IPCC should put pressure on certain governments, and why it's so difficult perhaps to put pressure on some governments. And both the US and the UK are mentioned here in the comments. So I let Silke start this time so that you don't have your answers being stolen. Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm sorry, I was reading questions, but could you shortly repeat your question?
It was questions about how you feel that the IPCC view is of social justice movement and like Friday for Futures, I think, but also if you feel that the IPCC's role is to put pressure on certain governments, and why it's so difficult to put pressure on certain governments or demand action, and linking to the UK and the US, maybe specifically.
Again, I would say because the IPCC has the mandate to be policy neutral or not prescriptive, it's not the job of the IPCC to put governments under pressure or to make them accountable. It's more to provide scientific evidence that there is a problem and there's urgency to act. And I guess I always made the claim that the IPCC should rethink this mandate. But on the other side, it's also dangerous to move beyond this mandate, because then the IPCC will be very politicized. And I don't think that the IPCC has to advocate action. This is dangerous. And so I would say that I have problems with climate justice movements or Fridays for Future if they say unite behind science and let's science explain what transformation means. This is a political problem, and these problems should be solved in policy making, not inside the IPCC.
Is everyone in agreement, or more comments on that?
Something that question stimulated in me is one of the biggest challenges I have as an author is when you're describing an adaptation space. I guess it's the same for mitigation, any kind of decision-making space. And you're aware that the majority literature, often critical, comes from a liberal Western kind of democratic context. And yet that's, in some ways a minority world. And but we are encouraged very strongly not to make any judgments on the way in which different political traditions of decision-making might lead to certain outcomes. So in terms of engaging with different governments, I guess indirectly, a more sort of centralized authoritarian regime set against those that are apparently more democratic and inclusive. So one ends up talking about quite abstract ideas like inclusivity, which would read across, rather than very pointedly suggesting that perhaps authoritarian regimes might not achieve. And at the same time, though, recognizing that, of course, if one's goal is to reduce risk, authoritarian regimes might actually be quite good at that, which is another reason why concepts like climate resilient development that bring social justice alongside mitigation and adaptation are really helpful. And, you could have a debate on whether climate resilient development is in some ways a device to allow for that kind of conversation about governance without being upfront about it.
Or would you like to?
Yeah, I just wanted to point one thing out, because I think maybe for the audience it's important to know that we're also the IPCC, it's very aggregated, right? So we have in Working Group 2, we have these regional chapters, but we don't have anything that talks about specific countries, and that specifically some countries will point out if you do mention their name and ask for it to be removed. And that's because it's supposed to be a global assessment, or and then disaggregated in the sense of these regions, but not beyond that. And therefore, that is also part of where it becomes a challenge to try to, to place these kinds of notions in the report.
There are a few questions on how to be more inclusive, and there is something here on is the IPCC now too conservative to be useful? There are also questions about why there's a bias against female scholars or women, as well as scholars from the Global South, if there's some explanation there. Do you have any thoughts around those questions?
Should I go? I think I just want to pick on the last thing. I think this is a really, really critical. So why is there such a bias? Why are there more men from the Global North in these reports? First of all, because it's a huge amount of work and it's really difficult for anybody with significant carrying duties. Somebody had posted in the chat the link to the Nature piece that it provides us a survey on women gender dimensions in the report, and it's really clear if you look at that the kinds of barriers that are faced by women in the female authors in the report. But the other thing and these are not necessarily things that are very different from other kinds of issues with women in science or in academia. On the other hand, I think what's important to recognize is that the reason why we have some of the reasons why we have so few Global South authors is because it's an unpaid role, right? So first of all, you have to consider that for many scientists from the Global South, they are already not getting a well-paid salary if they're in a university in the Global South. They often have to supplement their work with, with like consulting or other kinds of things to then do additionally on top of that, this IPCC work is a huge challenge. But also many universities don't consider it necessarily to be, many universities in Global South don't necessarily consider it to be such a sort of a career thing or something that they think is good. In fact, because they don't want their researchers to be taken away from being able to lecture or other kinds of things, or taking care of students. So it isn't necessarily something that all institutions, and this is probably also the case in some places in the Global North, that all institutions necessarily support. So there isn't always an incentive. It's not like, you get the invitation to be an author and everybody jumps up and down and for joy, because it's really not that easy. So that's just sort of to give a bit of context on that.
I've been pointed out that we are running out of time, but I would like to say that I think why are there not women anywhere? So I suppose that the issue in terms of female or voices from the Global South is part of a larger structure, where I suppose that also feeds into the IPCC. I'm not sure if Ilan would like to say anything. Otherwise, I'll say that it's been really nice to be here, and it's such an important topic that I hope we keep up, not only in relation to the IPCC, but I suppose anything we're doing, and especially if we're doing it over 30 years over and over and over again.